A 1979 New York Times article described her story as being, quote, one of the Western world's most intriguing and convincing cases of reincarnation. I myself am not a huge believer in reincarnation, mostly because any of the stories I've heard, there's no modern day corroboration of fact. But in Dorothy Eady's case, or as she became known, Setty's case, she has a number of things that line up with her story, with her lifelong story, that she in fact was from ancient Egypt and was actually a priestess in ancient Egypt times. And some of her discoveries are pretty incredible. And frankly, Egyptologists and historians that have looked at this case have spent decades trying to prove that she was lying, but can't. She had information that she shouldn't have had. That begins to make you wonder, maybe she really was reincarnated. Before we get started, if you could please gently destroy the like button and then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. I'm gonna be posting a ton of content just like this as many times a week as I can. I'm aiming for 3, if not 4, every week going forward, so please come along. The too long didn't read version of this story is you have Dorothy Eady, who as a child has a near-death experience. When she kind of comes back, she believes that she is no longer home, that her home is somewhere else. She starts having dreams about this place. She describes this garden and this big building, and then eventually she discovers that what she's describing is a place in ancient Egypt. And she ends up becoming obsessed with ancient Egypt and then begins providing information and helping with archaeological digs that leads to numerous incredible discoveries, all from memories that she claims to have had from her previous life. Even if you don't believe in reincarnation and this whole story seems like totally made up, just listen to how the story flows and then try to make sense of how in the world she had the information she had that led to distinct discoveries that nobody else had made. That they found this stuff as a result of Dorothy Eady's information. How do we reconcile that? It's not impossible, but no one's been able to do it yet. So let's see what you think. Dorothy Eady was born into a lower middle-class family in London in 1904. She was an only child and she was absolutely adored by her parents. Now, unfortunately, when she was 3 years old, she fell down a flight of stairs in her home and was unconscious. They called the doctor and the doctor shows up and says she's actually dead. As the parents are talking to the doctor, after about an hour, Dorothy gets up and goes into her bedroom and is like playing on her bed. And the parents come in with the doctor and they can't make any sense of it. And in fact, the parents were furious at the doctor for pronouncing her dead because they're like, obviously she wasn't. If she's just fine now, like, who are you? What kind of doctor are you? But the doctor swears she was dead. Shortly after the accident, Dorothy develops a strange accent that they can't quite place, and doctors and specialists believe that she's suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome, which is fairly common amongst people with significant head injuries. Basically, it alters your speech, and to people that don't know any better, they might think that you just have a strange foreign accent. Dorothy also started telling her parents about this recurring dream she had, where she'd be near this huge building with these big pillars, and she'd be in this beautiful garden. She loved this garden. She talked about the beautiful flowers and her friends that were there, and it was just this unbelievable place. It was like this oasis next to this building, but she didn't know where it was, and she's 3-4 years old, so she's not able to articulate much what this is, but she was just in love with this garden and this location in her dreams, and she talked about it endlessly. Dorothy's mother would find her daughter on her bed either before she went to sleep or when she woke up, crying. Because Dorothy longed to actually be in this place in her dreams, which she started calling home. Now, Dorothy's mother would say, but Dorothy, you're home now. And she would say, no, I'm not home. My home is in that garden, it's near that building. And no matter how Dorothy's mother tried to kind of convince her that, no, honey, you live here now, you live here, you've never lived anywhere else, Dorothy was unbelievably convinced that what she was seeing in her dreams was her actual home. It was around this time that Dorothy's parents brought Dorothy to a British museum where they had a big ancient Egyptian exhibit set up. And when they went into the museum, Dorothy sees this exhibit, and she's immediately attracted to it. And as she gets closer, she starts seeing the statues of the pharaohs and pictures of the pyramids, and she sprints into the exhibit, runs away from her parents, and she's running to the different statues of the pharaohs and of the Sphinx and all of these different icons from ancient Egypt, and she's kissing their feet, and she's sobbing hysterically, and she's yelling, "I'm home, I'm home, I'm with my people." This little tiny kid is having this revelation that she's found home, and she refused to leave the museum. Finally, her parents, get her to calm down. They're pretty embarrassed as people are like looking at them like, "What's going on with your child?" She finally leaves with her parents, but at this point, now Dorothy has attached that place in her dreams that she longs to go with the beautiful garden. She's attached it to Egypt, to ancient Egypt. And so she becomes completely obsessed with ancient Egypt. Her obsession with ancient Egypt started to get her in trouble. When she'd go to Sunday school, her family is a very, very devout Catholic family. She would compare Catholicism to other ancient Egyptian religions. That got her in a lot of trouble, and in fact, they said, "You can't come to Sunday school anymore." Then she got expelled from her Catholic school because she refused to sing a number of the hymns that in some way disparaged ancient Egyptians. She was also told that she could no longer attend Sunday Mass for the same reasons. She was basically not welcome anymore. At 6 years old, Dorothy, who knew how to write and read in English, started to take a keen interest in hieroglyphics, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and she said that they were definitely familiar to her, but she had forgotten how to read it. When she was 7, she was looking through a textbook and she saw a picture of the Temple of Seti I, which is in Abydos, Egypt. And as soon as she saw the picture, it was a big picture of the temple, and then next to it kind of like the broken remains of what looks like maybe a garden of some kind. And she immediately said, "That is my home. That's where I'm from. Right there. Temple of Seti I in Abydos, Egypt. That's my home." And as she's looking at the picture and she's looking at those kind of tattered, broken remains, I mean, this is thousands of years old, she's looking at the area next to this big temple in the picture, and she's like, "That's the garden, but where are the trees? Where is everything? Why does it look like this?" Like, she didn't understand that was thousands of years ago that it was a garden, but she saw the picture and immediately knew it as her home. Also in the textbook was the picture of the pharaoh, Seti I, who the temple was named after. And when she saw the picture of the very well-preserved mummy, she was overcome because she claimed to have known him personally. At age 10, Edie was kind of discovered by world-renowned Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge, who offered to teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics, which she picked up almost instantly. Starting at 14, in addition to that recurring dream of the Temple of Seti and the garden right next to the Temple of Seti that she claimed was her home, she started having a recurring nightmare where she, in her former life, was in this subterranean enclosure, and she was being questioned by a high priestess who was demanding that she answered her questions, and when she refused, she was beaten. At 27 years old, Edie meets an Egyptian man and falls in love with him, but also, I'm sure on some level, she was marrying him to secure Egyptian residency, because as soon as they got married, they moved right back to Egypt where she could be a resident. And actually, when they landed in Egypt, the first thing she did, she's overcome with emotion when she lands, and she starts kissing the ground and crying and saying, "I'm home, I'm home." Dorothy and her Egyptian husband have a son, and they name him Seti, just like the pharaoh Seti. Once Edie moved to Egypt, she started, by her account, getting visits from an entity known as Hor-Ra. Now, Hor-Ra, she claimed, was the spirit of the pharaoh Seti I. She would get into these almost trance-like states at night over that first year she was in Egypt. It was like she'd be sleeping, but then she would get up and be in this trance, and she would start frantically writing in hieroglyphics in the middle of the night. And her husband would wake up and he would see her doing this, and she was like, he couldn't stop her, he couldn't communicate with her. She was just in a trance, recording what she was claiming Hor-Ra was telling her, was dictating to her that she needed to write down. And it was in fact about who she used to be. She used to be, according to Hor-Ra, a woman by the name of Ben Trishit, who lived 3,000 years earlier in the time of Pharaoh Seti I, and who lived in the temple of Seti in and around that garden. So after a year of her going into these trances and writing in hieroglyphics, she had over 70 pages of transcript of what she claims was her story, and it goes like this. Before being born as Dorothy Eady, she was an Egyptian woman named Ben Trishit. Her father was a soldier and her mother was a vegetable seller who actually died when she was just 3 years old. Unable to care for her, Ben Trishit's father placed her in the temple of Qam el-Sultan. She was then raised at the temple where she later became a priestess. When she was 12 years old, Ben Trishit was given two choices: either venture out into the world on her own or become a consecrated virgin and stay at the temple. Ben Trishit decided to take the vows. But a few years later, she meets Pharaoh Seti I, and they end up falling in love, and soon she becomes pregnant. When she is discovered to be pregnant, she was interrogated by the high priest and beaten when she refused to answer, a scene that corresponded to her childhood nightmare. Unwilling to put her beloved Seti through a public scandal, Ben Trishit took her own life. Eady's husband grew increasingly disturbed watching his wife go into these trances and write out the hieroglyphics. I mean, she's amassing all these pages of hieroglyphics. Her whole thing was just too much for him, and so he ultimately filed for divorce in 1936. Following the divorce, Dorothy and her young son leave and go live in another town near the Giza pyramids, and she starts going by the name Seti, which means mother of Seti. So she doesn't go by Dorothy Eady anymore. And at this point, she also takes a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, and she begins a very lengthy and highly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Seti would research almost exclusively the temple of Seti I and learn everything about not only the temple but the people who lived there, because it was where she believed she used to live. But it wouldn't be until 1952, when she's almost in her 50s, that she finally actually steps foot in Abydos. And it was because of a job transfer that put her there. And in fact, she took a pay cut to get this job. She was so desperate to just finally step foot in the place that she believed was her old home. As soon as she walked into the temple, the first thing she says is, "It's as if I've lived here before." And she quickly sets up a office in one of the temple rooms and spends almost all of her time there. And she even befriends a cobra and feeds the cobra daily, and just has this cobra friend that just hangs out with her, which no one could make any sense of. Lots of rumors swirled around whether this woman was sane, but because her contributions to Egyptology were so pronounced and so useful, that she was very highly regarded. But of all of her accomplishments, of all of the things that she did, the thing that she is most known for is when she was able, as soon as she got to the temple of Seti I, identify exactly where the garden was. For Seti, she'd been having dreams of this garden her whole life. And so she very quickly said, if you dig here, you're going to find this garden. And sure enough, they dug down and there was the garden. And in fact, she had described the layout of the garden, what trees were where, what types of trees were there, and it was all confirmed once they dug it up. She was also instrumental in identifying where to dig on the north side of the temple, where she said there was a tunnel that ran underneath. It was a secret tunnel. And sure enough, they dug down, there was the tunnel. That was something that they had never seen before. Only she knew about it, and there was no way she would have known about it without prior knowledge. In addition, she also pointed researchers to search in a specific area, in an area known as the Valley of the Kings, for a tomb, a long forgotten tomb. And sure enough, almost exactly where she described, there was in fact a tomb that had never been discovered before. As much as other Egyptologists did not want to accept Seti's claims that she had been reincarnated, and that's why she has all this knowledge, they wanted, frankly, it to be just the ramblings of a crazy person and it to just be some elaborate hoax, but they couldn't deny the fact that she had intimate knowledge of certainly everything that ever happened at the temple of Seti I in the time frame that she claimed to have been living there 3,000 years prior. Fascinatingly, right before she died, when she was 81, she said that there was a a secret underneath the temple of Seti I. There was a secret chamber, and there was a secret within that secret chamber. But no one's ever gone down there. No one knows where to begin to look. And so without Seti guiding them, it may be one of those things that we'll just never know. So without any sort of rational explanation for how she would have had all this knowledge or understanding of an ancient culture, it leaves skeptics wondering, I mean, is this potentially a real case of reincarnation, or is there a better explanation? And I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. So that's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this, please like the video and hit subscribe. I'm going to be posting multiple times a week stories about the strange, mysterious, dark stuff. If that's the kind of thing you like, then I'm the channel for you, I hope. Also, please follow me on TikTok. My handle is also MrBallen. And then on Instagram, it's JohnBallen416. That's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. See ya. In 1947, a disturbing distress signal was sent out kind of in all directions, like a blind distress signal from some point in the Indian Ocean. Numerous American, Dutch, and English ships, along with other international listening stations, heard this distress signal. And once they triangulated where it was coming from, they sent out a search party to go see who needed help. When they arrived on scene, they discovered something that would become one of the most famous maritime mysteries of all time. This is the story of the SS Orang Medan. What's going on, guys? MrBallen here. I was a Navy SEAL for a little while, and now I tell strange, dark, and mysterious stories on the internet. YouTube is my new passion, and I'm going to be posting at least 2 times a week going forward. And if you like this kind of content, please right now hit like on this video and subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss any of this stuff. Thank you very much. Before we get into the story, I want you guys to be looking at this through the lens of trying to decipher whether or not you believe this really happened, because there is a large percentage of people that say this is just an urban legend. However, there is a couple details that make it really hard to just write off. Number one, you have a number of international ships and listening stations that all reported hearing this same distress signal, and it's a very unique distress signal that we'll get into. In addition, you have the U.S. Coast Guard in one of their, fairly credible publications published a story about this case 5 years after it happened. And then you have the fact that this case has been around since 1947, it's been 70 plus years, and no one's officially debunked it. So let's dive in. In 1947, several Dutch, American, and English ships, along with a number of listening stations, picked up the strange distress signal that was coming from somewhere in the Indian Ocean. The distress signal, which was in Morse code, went like this.
An officer, including the captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead.
Then there was a burst of indecipherable Morse code, and then it ended with 2 words.
I die.
Then silence. One ship that heard this distress signal was the Silver Star. It was an American vessel that was kind of patrolling the waterways around the coast of Malaysia, and with the help of other ships in and around the Indian Ocean and some of the listening stations, they were able to triangulate the location of this distress signal. And they pinpointed a ship called the SS Orang Medan that was located right at the end of the Strait of Malacca, which is the primary shipping lane between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And so this ship was basically drifting out towards the Indian Ocean. And so the first thing that the Silver Star does is they try to send a message back to the Orang Medan. But after numerous failed attempts, the captain of the Silver Star decides that we need to go investigate because something is obviously not right here. So the Silver Star tells all the other ships in the area, along with the other listening stations, that they are going to be the search party. They're going to reroute and head for the Orang Medan, because at this point, anybody that had heard that signal is saying, like, what do we do? Like, are we going to go investigate? Are you? After a couple of hours of heading straight for the Orang Medan, they see off in the distance the ship. From the eyes of these very experienced sailors on the Silver Star, they knew almost immediately that this ship is dead in the water. It's just drifting, which is not a good sign, especially if you combine that with the signal they got. As they get closer and closer to this ship, it becomes creepier and creepier because they're looking up, and in the bridge where, you know, the steering wheel would be, they can't make any person out. There's no one up there. There's nobody standing on the edge. I mean, they just sent this distress signal. You would think with a ship that's dead in the water that they would be lining the outside of the ship trying to signal someone down. But no, it's just quiet. No one on board, all lights off, just drifting, bobbing in the choppy waters of the Indian Ocean. And so as they get closer, they start blowing their whistle to try to attract anybody on the Orang Medan to signal them back. They're also doing more Morse code to try to get their attention again, not being picked up. And so finally, after all these failed attempts and just the general weirdness around it, the captain of the Silver Star decides, we need to board this ship. So these Silver Star crew members, they knew before they boarded that almost definitely they were going to find something terribly wrong with this ship. There's just too many red flags about it. They were anticipating something bad, but I don't think that they were really prepared for just how bad this was going to be. So they board the ship, and right away on deck is a number of crew members that had passed away. They're all deceased. And the mystery really kicks in the position, the body position of all of the dead crew members. They were all on their back with their hands outstretched in front of them as if defending themselves from some unseen assailant above them. Even strangers, they had this look of abject terror on their face, as if the final moments before they died were just excruciatingly painful and terrifying. Even the dog was in a position with its teeth bared, it looked like it was growling up into the sky. All of them. And so obviously the Silver Star crew members are, you know, shocked at what they find. And they're kind of looking at each of these dead crew members and they're like, what is going on? So they make their way up to the bridge, and everybody's also dead in the same position, basically fighting with some unseen assailant in their final moments before they pass. The person who had been sending out the distress signal had literally slouched over the telegraph. Like their finger was literally on the telegraph. He's the only one that was not doing this. He was on the telegraph and had passed away in that position. So they go down into the bowels of the ship. Normally, inside of a steel ship in the boiler room, it's going to be pretty hot. There's no real ventilation to speak of. Not to mention outside, it was over 100 degrees. They went down into the boiler room and down into the ship, and it was strikingly cold. Some of the crew members from the Silver Star said it felt like it might have been about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They found more crew members also passed away, also fighting with something in the air, with that look of abject terror on their face. So all of the crew has perished in this very bizarre way. There was no overt damage to the ship. It just appeared that the engine had been turned off, but ultimately the ship had no real damage to it at all. They couldn't find anything. The crew, despite meeting a fairly unfortunate end, also had no signs of outside injury, external injury. Something had obviously caused them all to perish, but there was no injuries outside their body. In addition, all of them showed signs of rapidly decomposing. Considering they had just been tapping away that distress signal hours earlier, unless the person communicating the distress signal had been the last one alive for a long time, it doesn't really add up that they had decomposed as quickly as they had relative to when this distress signal was sent. So the captain of the Silver Star, taking into account all of the strangeness, decides not to touch any of the bodies, leave them where they are, get off the ship, tie a tow line to the Orang Medan, and tow it in. We're going to have experts look at this and figure out what happened. And so they attach the tow line, the crew members of the Silver Star, and as soon as they begin to move it, they notice, the crew of the Silver Star, that smoke has begun billowing out of the inside of the Orang Medan. And so, not taking any chances, they cut the tow line and they literally jump back onto the Silver Star right as the Orang Medan explodes. In fact, there was a quote which basically said it exploded with so much force that it was lifted out of the water entirely and then splashed back down and rapidly sank. So now you have no evidence. You have the testimony of the people that were on the ship, but other than that, you have no evidence. The ship is now gone. The captain of the Silver Star and his crew just have to go back to the mainland to try to make sense of what they just saw, because you have all these people that were involved and want to know what happened, and they're like, well, let me tell you, we saw this horrible thing on board and then it exploded and it disappeared. And so that's where the mystery kind of ends. But here we go. Let's get into what the primary critique is, because that's important here too. And then we'll hear the rebuttal, which I think is also pretty important. So people that believe this story is just a legend will point to the fact that there really isn't a good record of the SS Orang Medan ever existing. There's this one very important publication called Lloyd's Shipping Registers, where you would expect the Orang Medan to be registered, but they're not. Others will say that, well, Orang Medan translates to man of Medan, and Medan is near Sumatra, and that's where they were registered. So they weren't in Lloyd's Shipping Registers, they were in another registry. But either way, there is contention around whether or not this ship ever existed. But for those who say that this could be true, they say that, well, there's a good reason why those records don't exist, because someone's trying to cover it up. According to a German researcher who had spent decades covering the Orang Medan case, he published in the Death Ship on the South Seas, it's a publication from 1953, that the Orang Medan was transporting illegal materials, things like nitroglycerin and potassium cyanide. These are things used to create weapons. And there might have been a leak that led to the death of everyone on board. No physical injuries, but they passed away. And then also, after they tied that tow line, the materials could have detonated. Perhaps they detonated, that kind of thing. And so that still leads some questions, right? I mean, then how did the Silver Star crew not also get exposed to these chemicals as soon as they got there? Either way, it's a fascinating story, and I hope that you took something from it. So if you haven't already, I would really appreciate it if you liked this video and you hit subscribe on my channel. I will be posting at least 2 times a week going forward, content just like this, so I hope you'll join, and that's gonna do it, guys. Thank you. On the evening of June 7th, 2023, a 36-year-old man named Umar Abdullah walked into his bedroom in Tampa Bay, Florida, and right away he opened up all the windows. Now, keep in mind, Tampa Bay, Florida is really hot. And so by doing this, he was letting in all this really hot air, but Umar did not care. He just wanted whatever was inside of his apartment out. Umar, along with his wife Samira and their 10-month-old daughter, had just gotten back to their apartment after a trip to Ohio, and the second they walked inside, they had smelled this weird smell. And it was something they had never smelled before. This was not like rotten food or anything like that. This was like a chemical smell. But even that wasn't a good description. It was like a cross between chemicals and maybe paint. And so at first, Umar and Samira just walked around their apartment, predominantly in the kitchen, looking for things that could be leaking, in the fridge or in cupboards or whatever, but they couldn't find anything that seemed like it could be the cause of the smell. And it was around this point, when they were totally stumped, that Umar and Samira remembered that their apartment building was extremely well taken care of. Like, repairs were done immediately and all the time in every single unit, and the fact that they had been away in Ohio had been known to their apartment manager. And so they thought, maybe while they were gone, maybe somebody had come in here and maybe touched up some paint or made some repairs or something, even though it seemed a bit weird that they hadn't been informed beforehand that, painting or repairs were going to take place in their apartment. But ultimately, that's what they chalked it up to. And so it was at this point that Umar and Samira walked all around the apartment, opening up all the windows, and Samira also lit a candle as well. And pretty soon that weird smell disappeared, and both the parents just kind of forgot about it. And so Umar grabbed all their luggage from their trip and began unpacking it into the drawers and putting toiletries away. And at the same time, Samira put their baby in a high chair in the kitchen, and then Samira began preparing dinner. And a few minutes later, as Umar was still putting things away, he heard Samira calling from the kitchen to, hey, come out here for a second. And so Umar stopped what he was doing, he went into the kitchen, and he looked at Samira, and she was looking very concerned down at their daughter. And their daughter was in her high chair, and her dinner was right in front of her, but she wasn't eating. And their daughter seemed really fussy. And normally their daughter was such a get-along kid who never fussed, who always ate her food. And so this seemed really out of character. And so both parents kind of stared at the daughter for a second. And then Umar was like, you know what? All the windows are still open and it's getting pretty hot in here. Maybe the baby's just fussy about the heat.
And so Samira agreed that could totally be it. And so the parents went around the apartment, closing down all the windows, allowing the air conditioning to kick back on and cool the apartment down. But about an hour later, after the apartment had cooled back down, the baby was still very fussy. And at this point, Umar and Samira were trying to put the baby to bed, and they were really struggling with that. And also, in addition to the baby obviously not feeling very well, Umar and Samira both began to complain that they had headaches. And so at this point, the parents assumed that, you know what, all of this, the baby's behavior and now our headaches must be tied to just the travel we just went through, and we just need a day to recover here. And so they kind of rushed their baby through her bedtime routine and eventually got her down. And then Umar and Samira took some ibuprofen to help with their headaches. And then they too climbed in bed and drifted off to sleep, hoping that when they woke up, everybody would feel better again. But the next morning, nobody was better. In fact, everybody was doing worse. Umar's headache had now gotten much stronger, and Samira, she still had a headache, but also was very lethargic, and the baby was still very fussy. And over the next few days, their symptoms continued to get worse and worse. Umar's headache went from really bad to pretty much blinding, like he couldn't do anything else but think about his headache. And Samira basically had to lay down all day. It was like no matter how much she slept, she had zero energy, and their poor baby just continued to cry and fuss all the time, and even began to vomit. And so it seemed pretty obvious by this point, after a few days, that the three of them must have caught some sort of bug while they were traveling. That this was not just jet lag, that they actually had some sort of illness. But the parents were convinced that, they could just kind of rough it out, and eventually, after a couple of days, they would get better. But on the morning of June 14th, so this is now a week after coming back home from their trip, not only were all their symptoms still really bad, but on this particular morning, things took a dark turn. That morning, when Umar went to his daughter's bedroom, he's still dealing with this horrible headache. He makes his way into the bedroom, and he goes down to pick his daughter up from her crib, and as he's reaching down to grab her, he freezes. Because on the bed, on the pillow right behind the baby, is all the baby's hair. The baby had clearly lost huge chunks of her hair. And so Umar at this point forgot about his headache and yelled for Samira, and even though she's super lethargic, she could tell this is an emergency, so she got up and made her way into the bedroom, and she looked down too and saw all the hair, and she reached down and scooped the baby up, and she turned the baby over, and sure enough, there was a huge bald spot on the back of their baby's head. But Umar and Samira, they said to each other right away that, wait a minute, I know this is scary, but it is actually a thing that newborn babies sometimes do lose their hair. But when they went online and looked at the age range of when that's kind of a common thing to happen, it was pretty obvious that their baby, being 10 months old, was a little bit too old for losing her hair to be considered a normal thing. And so Umar and Samira sat there and continued Googling, what could this be? My 10-month-old baby is losing her hair. And there were lots of explanations ranging from, ringworm to some severe infection to some rare genetic disorder. And all of it was kind of terrifying. And also none of it really lined up with what they were seeing with their daughter. And so the parents were like, you know what? Clearly, we don't know what this is. We've all been sick for a week. We have to bring our baby to the doctor. And so as Samira got on the phone and called the baby's doctor, Umar hopped in the shower to get ready to go to the doctor. And as soon as he began shampooing his hair, he noticed clumps of his hair were falling out. And so all of a sudden it dawned on him that whatever's going on with his baby is going on with him, and very likely going on with his wife too. And it was at this point too that Umar remembered that strange smell when they first walked into their apartment after coming back from their trip. Now, they had opened up all the windows and lit candles, and, the smell had kind of dissipated, and then they had shut the windows again, and they hadn't smelled it again. And so Umar began thinking, wait a minute, maybe we've just gone nose blind to the smell, and maybe there's some sort of contamination in the air. Maybe there's a gas leak or something worse than that. And so as soon as Umar got out of the shower and told his wife about how he lost hair and kind of his theory that maybe there was some contamination in their apartment, Umar called his landlord and explained, the whole situation. And the landlord would tell Umar right off the top that, during the time they were in Ohio, nobody went inside their apartment. So there's no fresh paint in there, no maintenance was done. So whatever you smelled was not from us. And then the landlord said to Umar that, as scary as it sounds, it's possible that you might have like a gas leak inside of your apartment, or maybe you have a freon leak from your air conditioning system, or maybe there's toxic mold. But whatever it is, we're going to get people in there, we're going to find the issue and solve it. And so later that day, sure enough, a gas inspector showed up to Umar and Samira's apartment, and they checked the entire place, and they could not find any trace of a gas leak. They checked everywhere. There was no leak, but they did tell Umar and Samira that yes, we can smell a faint trace of some chemical smell, but we don't think it's gas. And then after the gas inspector left, the landlord went out and found a mold inspector who came into Umar and Samira's apartment. They looked everywhere and could not find any mold. Then the landlord brought in a plumber to check the hot water heater, but no issues with that. Then the landlord brought an HVAC company in, and they checked the air conditioning units, and there was no leak. And so finally, after the landlord had kind of run out of ideas for who to bring over to check the apartment, because again, by this point, nobody had found anything wrong with the apartment, Umar just said, you know what? I'm going to call the fire department. And so Umar, he calls the fire department, and the fire department, they send over their hazardous materials team or their hazmat team. And so they go into the apartment and they look everywhere, and there is nothing. They could not find any source that was causing the smell at all. It seemed very much like their apartment was totally safe and fine. But by this point, it's now been 2 weeks since Umar, Samira, and their baby had come back from that trip, and they still felt totally horrible. Umar still had his headaches, he was still losing his hair, Samira had begun losing her hair as well, she still had her headaches, she still felt lethargic, and their baby was still losing her hair, and she still was fussy and miserable. And all three of them now had developed this weird shortness of breath, where they'd just be walking through the apartment, and suddenly it was like they couldn't even breathe. And so now they've had all these people who can't find anything wrong with their apartment. They'd gone to their doctors, and the doctors had no idea what was wrong with them. And so it was kind of like they had no idea what to do, but clearly this crisis was only getting worse and worse and worse. And so Umar felt like he had no more options. He couldn't leave his apartment. He couldn't afford to do that. And so they were just stuck in this place that seemed toxic. But all that would change on June 25th, so 2.5 weeks after they came home from that trip, because on this day, Umar discovered something about that chemical smell they caught right when they came back in after the trip. You know, the smell that all the people that had come into the apartment had sort of noticed but couldn't identify. On June 25th, Umar figured something out about that smell. Umar was in his apartment feeling completely miserable, as was his wife and his daughter who were in the bedroom. But at some point, Umar suddenly caught a whiff of that weird chemical smell. And as soon as he smelled it, he sort of began to cough, and he was about to call his landlord and be like, hey, I smelled it again. But he decided on this day, instead of calling anybody else, he was going to run an experiment of his own. And so instead of trying to get away from the smell, Umar began smelling in the air as deep as he could to try to kind of figure out where the smell was coming from. And so he began walking around his apartment, sniffing the air, kind of tracing the smell, and slowly but surely he began kind of following the smell through his kitchen, down the hallway, all the way to his front door. And when he got to his front door, he smelled in again, and he could tell the smell was the strongest right now. And so feeling a sudden jolt of adrenaline, he grabbed the door, flung it open, half expecting to see like a chemical cloud floating in the air in the hallway. But as soon as he opened the door, there was nothing outside. And when he smelled in the hallway, you know, the smell wasn't really there anymore. And so he kind of looked around for a second, feeling kind of silly, and then he shut the door, and he was about to just go back into his apartment and just kind of accept that once again, I got no idea what's going on here. But then he stopped, and he turned back around and looked at the actual door, like the actual front door of his apartment. And he began smelling the door. And the door definitely had the chemical smell. And so he began smelling and tracing his hands all over this door, not even sure what he was looking for. But eventually he worked his way all the way to the bottom of the door. And that's when he felt something. And so suddenly Umar got down and stared at the strange thing he had found on his door. And as soon as he saw what it was, he jumped up and ran to his wife to tell her what he had just found. After talking with his wife about this thing, they came up with a plan. Late that night, Umar waited until the entire apartment complex seemed really quiet, and then as quietly as he could, he opened up that front door, he stepped out into the hallway, and then he made his way over to the big fake plant that stood at the end of this hallway that was kind of right outside, kind of adjacent to his door, and he hid something in the plant, and then Umar went back into his apartment and he shut the door. And on June 27th, so 2 days later, the moment Umar and Samira had been waiting for finally arrived. At around 5:30 p.m. that evening, suddenly that chemical smell began to emanate through the apartment, and their baby began coughing so badly she began vomiting. And so as Samira was tending to their baby, Umar very quietly opened up his front door, looked in the hallway, didn't see anyone, and he rushed over to that plant, and he took the thing he had hidden a couple of days before, and he went back into his apartment, shut the door, and went into his office. And when Umar came out of that office a little while later, Samira was waiting, and she was looking at him, and as Umar came out, it was like he was totally ashen-faced, he looked completely shocked, and he could barely speak. And Samira said, "What's going on? What did you learn?" And Umar said, "We have to get out of here right now. Get the baby. We have to leave right now. We're going to the hospital." And so as Samira bundled up their baby and they started getting their things together, Umar called 911 and told the operator what he had just discovered. The strange thing Umar had discovered on his front door 2 days earlier on June 25th was a weird crack at the very base of his door where you could basically see from inside of his apartment out into the hallway. And the thing Umar and his wife had decided to hide in the hallway in that plant was a video camera aimed at their front door because they were suspicious that something was making its way through that crack in the door into their apartment, and they wanted to catch it on camera. And that's exactly what happened 2 days later when around 5:30 p.m., their daughter began coughing and Umar began to smell that smell in the apartment, and he rushed out, he got his camera, he went back into his office, he watched the footage, and he could not believe what his camera had recorded. Just before 5:30 p.m. on June 25th, so right before the smell came into the apartment, on video you see this guy walk up the stairs and enter the hallway right in front of Umar and Samira's apartment door. And this man had a syringe in his hand, and he knelt down and he placed the syringe into that crack at the bottom of Umar and Samira's door, and he pushed the plunger of the syringe before pulling the syringe out, quickly turning and disappearing down the stairs. And so as Umar and Samira and their baby rushed to the hospital after discovering this video and after calling 911 to tell police what they saw on this video, the police rushed to Umar and Samira's apartment complex. Not to go to Umar and Samira's apartment though, instead to go to the apartment right below Umar and Samira. The man who rented that apartment right below them was a 36-year-old named Zuming Lee. He was a married father of two who was working on his PhD in chemistry from the University of South Florida. And Umar and Samira thought of him as being a really nice guy. He was very quiet, he kept to himself. He even gave them a gift after their daughter was born. But on this evening, when the police arrived at Zuming's apartment and knocked on the door, when Zuming opened it up, he was immediately arrested. It would turn out, despite Zuming giving Umar and Samira that gift after their baby was born, well, that was the end of him liking Umar and Samira. Because as soon as they came home with their baby, Zuming became obsessed with how noisy their baby was. Even if their baby was barely being loud, it completely consumed Zuming's mind. It was like he was obsessed with listening for this baby. And then suddenly it wasn't just the baby that annoyed him, it was even the slightest noise he heard above him coming from Umar and Samira's apartment that totally sent him into a rage. And so Zuming began constantly going to the homeowners association to complain about the baby and, the toilet sounds and the footsteps he was hearing. And when that wasn't enough, he began going to the police about it. Now, Umar and Samira had been told that their downstairs neighbor really was upset with how loud they were being, and so they did everything they could to be quiet. They felt so bad that they were coming off as being these very loud and disrespectful people, which they were not. They did have a little baby, and babies make noise, but they were doing everything they could to be quiet. And so they had no idea that Zuming was still just completely furious at them. And eventually, Zuming's fury just became completely unhinged, and he used his chemistry know-how, because remember, he's studying for his PhD in chemistry, to begin putting together this deadly mixture of chemicals that contain things like methadone and hydrocodone, and he put them into a syringe, and he began injecting them into Umar and Samira's apartment to poison them to make them be quiet. And so by the time Zuming was arrested, he had been injecting these deadly chemicals into their apartment for a month. That was obviously the cause of all of Umar and Samira and their baby's symptoms. It was this poison. Umar, Samira, and their baby would get treatment and they would fully recover from their poisoning. But very likely, had they not been quick thinkers and put that camera in place and caught Zuming in the act, it's entirely possible that over time, the poison that was being injected into their apartment would have killed them. Officials are still investigating this case as it's still relatively new. However, the legal process was paused when Zhu Ming was deported back to China. Zhu Ming has not been convicted of any crime, and the criminal case remains open, and if Zhu Ming ever were to step foot on US soil, he would be arrested immediately.
There is nothing quite as satisfying as a true story that's mysterious and interesting, it sucked you in, that has a killer plot twist, a killer reveal. That, to me, is just the most satisfying thing you can find. I am a complete story addict, and so I go looking for these stories. I go literally searching for real-life stories with real-life plot twists. And in my opinion, the very best one is the story of the missing lighthouse keepers, and that is the story I'm going to tell today. So the too long didn't read version of this story is a crew is sent out to this lighthouse off the coast of Scotland. They're being sent out there to relieve the workers that are there, provide new supplies, and just kind of make sure everything is okay. When they get out there, nothing is okay. The 3 lighthouse keepers are missing. The island and the lighthouse are kind of in disarray. And then they find the lighthouse keeper's logbook, which, needless to say, is very strange. It has some entries in it that don't really add up. And then when you combine those entries with what some people had to say on the mainland that were watching the island, it really doesn't add up. So it creates this really epic plot twist. It's absolutely worth watching to the end, I promise. So let's get there. Off the coast of northwestern Scotland lies a stretch of 7 small islands. It's called the Flannan Isles. One of those isles is called Eilean Moor, and on Eilean Moor is a lighthouse, and that's where our story is going to be centered. But before we get into the story, Eilean Moor has some odd history to it. It's long been regarded as a place that's paranormal. In fact, on the island, basically the only people that inhabit it are the lighthouse keepers. Usually there's 3 or 4 of them, and sheep. And so sheep herders often go out to that island, and they're the ones that report hearing strange sounds and just feeling like they're being watched. It's a creepy place. And in fact, anybody that visits the island that isn't a sheep herder or a lighthouse keeper, even if they've never heard of the history of Eilean Moor, oftentimes report a very odd sense of being watched, of just not feeling right on that island. And so Eilean Moor really had developed a reputation as being a pretty creepy place. So in addition to just the strange aura around the island that basically anyone who went there reported, anybody that went to the Church of St. Flannan is its name, they reported feeling like they were being drawn to pray. that there was this overwhelming sense that you should be praying as soon as you walk into the church. And in fact, the draw was so strong, like getting on your knees and praying, that they developed this strange ritual that when you got to the island, it was customary that before you went in, you immediately dropped to your knees and crawled around the church on your knees before making your way inside and continuing to pray. So just a strange place with strange rituals. That's the scene that is set for this true life, very strange mystery. In December of 1900, a steamboat was passing by the Flannan Isles, and as they rounded their way past Eilean Moor, they noticed that the light was out. The lighthouse was not operational. And so when that steamboat finally got to port 3 days later, they told authorities that, hey, Eilean Moor is not operational. You should go check on them. And so as it happened, it was actually time to replace the lighthouse keepers that were at Eilean Moor. So Captain James Harvey gets his crew together, and he takes Joseph Moore, who's the replacement lighthouse keeper, and they head out to Eilean Moor to check on the lighthouse, check on the lighthouse keepers, but also replace them. So it was a changing of the guard and making sure that everything was okay. As you approach Eilean Moor, you would see a massive staircase coming up from the dock all the way up to where the lighthouse is. So from a distance, if you were looking at Eilean Moor, it would be fairly easy to break out anybody that was walking down the steps to get down to the dock. And since the island was really only inhabited by lighthouse keepers and sheep, the crew, Captain Harvey and his crew, as they're making their approach to Eilean Moor, they're watching those steps to see if the lighthouse keepers are going to notice them and come down and greet them on the dock, because that was customary. You always are at the dock ready to assist the crew as they come into Eilean Moor. That was just the way it was done. And so as they're making their approach, they're watching these steps, looking for signs that the keepers are coming down, because on some level, the crew that's going out to replace them, on the back of their head, they're a little bit nervous that something's wrong. I mean, they know that the lighthouse was not operational, and that's part of the reason they're going out. So they're kind of like actively watching those steps. They're looking for signs that they're coming down to the dock. And as they get closer and closer, they don't see anybody come down the steps. They don't see anyone on the dock. And even worse, no preparations were made for the next crew to come into the dock. That was something that all lighthouse keepers did. They kept that dock, up to codes that if any time someone came in, they could properly dock and make their way up. So no preparations are made. No one is coming down to greet them. So the omen is pretty bad. And so Captain Harvey and his crew, they dock on the dock, and the captain and his crew say, hey, to Joseph Moore, you go up and just do a cursory examination of the island. Make sure these guys are okay. We'll stay down here for a minute. You go check. So Joseph Moore gets out, and he starts walking up this massive set of stairs where he can't see the lighthouse. He can only see the steps. It's pretty steep. And later he would say that he had this deep sense of just foreboding, like something bad is about to happen. He felt very stressed out as he's walking up these stairs. And as he makes his way up, he finally kind of crests to where he can actually start to break out the top of the island, where you can see the lighthouse and you can see, where they were staying. And the first thing he notices is the steel railings that line this massive staircase up to the island near the lighthouse itself. The steel railings had been bent over. Like, imagine if it was made out of tinfoil. They had been folded onto themselves. Like, pretty significant damage to, steel railings. And so he makes note of that. And he also notices that this big boulder that I don't think it was decorative, it just was on the island, and so they built around it. There's this huge boulder that just was right in front of the lighthouse, and it had been that way for, years and years. It had moved significantly, and you could actually see a trail underneath the boulder where it had rolled across the grass. So Joseph Moore, the replacement lighthouse keeper, is thinking to himself, my God, this is straight out of the storm of the century. Like, clearly the worst storm ever has hit this island. No wonder their lighthouse was non-operational, because they were hit with like the worst storm ever. And so that's his initial assessment. He goes up to the door. The door is unlocked, but shut, and he opens it up. First thing he does is he yells for the lighthouse keepers that are supposed to be there. They don't call back. There's apparently no one in the lighthouse. Before he even starts moving through the lighthouse, he looks on his right and he sees all the hooks where they would have kept their clothes. And One hook still is holding an oilskin jacket. And anytime you would leave the lighthouse, especially if you were leaving the island for some reason, there is no reason in the world you would not be wearing that jacket. So it's another kind of bad sign. It means that if they're not here, if the 3 lighthouse keepers are not inside of this lighthouse, why aren't all 3 oilskins gone with them? It's another sign that something terrible has happened. He looks into the kitchen, and on the kitchen table is plates of meat. There is, pickles that have just been pulled out of a jar, and a couple of the chairs have been upturned. And he also noticed that the mechanical clocks had stopped. And so he's thinking to himself, okay, something happened where they left in a hurry, because they toppled over chairs, they left food on the table, someone forgot their jacket. He continues moving through the lighthouse, and he gets to their bedrooms, and all of their beds are unmade. Again, it was kind of customary that you would never leave the lighthouse unmade. You would make your bed because someone else could be coming in to relieve you. And so it was yet another sign to Joseph Moore that something had happened suddenly that caused the lighthouse keepers to abandon the lighthouse. Combining that with the massive damage from the storm, he's starting to think, something happened, this horrible storm is coming through. Like maybe it got really bad really quickly and they didn't have time to make proper preparations. They didn't have time to do the things that were customary. They just had to kind of boogie out of there. So Joseph Moore returns to Captain Harvey and says, this is what I saw. And so Captain Harvey and the crew go back up and they kind of see it for themselves. And Captain Harvey ends up sending a telegram back to the mainland explaining that there has been a horrible tragedy here. A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows. They must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. After Captain Harvey sends this telegram, he and Joseph Moore and the rest of the crew continue to kind of search the island and do some investigating. And they discover the logbook that the 3 lighthouse keepers had been keeping. And so all of the entries are pretty standard. It was, common practice that you would mark down what happened that day, what ships you saw, just kind of basic log keeping of the lighthouse. But they start getting really interesting on December 12th. On December 12th, the leader of the 3 lighthouse keepers noted that severe winds, the likes of which he had never seen before, he's been doing this for decades, are passing through the island. And he's acting pretty worried about whether or not the lighthouse will be able to withstand this storm. He also noted that the other 2 lighthouse keepers were not doing well. He said one of them had been basically just praying nonstop. The other had been doing a bit of crying. Now, the man he's describing that is crying over the intensity of this storm was known on the mainland as one of the toughest, saltiest men on the planet, who had weathered dozens of hurricanes out on islands all by himself. And so for him to be crying over the severity of the storm just shows you how severe the storm really was. The entries on the 13th and 14th point to them believing that they're not going to get out of this storm alive. At this point, all 3 of them are just praying nonstop and are kind of anticipating at some point they're just going to get swept off the island. Then on December 15th, it just says, storm ended, sea is calm, God is over all. So Robert Moorhead, who is one of the leaders of the investigation, said that basically on December 15th, after that final entry was made, they must have gone down to the dock to secure some of the supplies and just kind of make sure that it wasn't totally damaged from all of the storm, and a rogue wave from this storm must have swept them away. When word got to the Scottish mainland about what had happened to these lighthouse keepers, the people that sat on the coast facing Eilean Moor, they were really confused, because whenever there's a storm out at Eilean Moor, they can see it because the island's not that far off the coast and they can see the storm. But over the past few days, namely December 12th to the 15th, which was the time period those log entries were made about the storm passing through, the people on the mainland of Scotland said that not only was there no storm, but in fact, the visibility onto Eilean Moor was better than it had been in years. They saw parts of the island that were only visible in perfect circumstances, meaning there was never any storm. So what the heck happened to those lighthouse keepers? What were those log entries about? Why were they drawn to tears? How did the railings get flipped over and the boulder get moved aside? Where did they go? In the years following their disappearance, other keepers were sent out to man that lighthouse, and all of them reported hearing someone yelling the names of the 3 lighthouse keepers that went missing. So pretty creepy stuff, and unfortunately it's still very much an unsolved mystery despite the official statement by Robert Moorhead. And so I'd love to hear in the comments what you think might have happened to the lighthouse keepers, and what could possibly explain that there wasn't a storm, but in the journal they said it was the worst storm ever, and there's physical damage done to the island. How do we reconcile that? Like, either someone's not telling the truth or something just doesn't add up. And I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. So if you haven't already, please like this video and hit subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Thank you all so much, and I'll talk to you soon.